Tonight, the wind does not howl. It drifts, low and slow, like it has nowhere to be. It slips through the narrow alleys of old Edo, brushing across roofs that have bowed slightly with age. Every beam, every tile, remembers footsteps that have long stopped falling. It is not cold, but there is a stillness, a kind of hush that only arrives after midnight, when the streets forget they were ever meant to carry sound. Just past the last tea house, where the streets narrow into silence, a red paper lantern is being lit. Its flame stutters at first, small and unsure, but soon glows steady, casting its soft orange circle across the wooden gate of the willow house. The gate is old, the kind that groans quietly when touched, has watched hundreds pass through it. Some with hope, some without names, some who never look back. Beneath the lantern, a line of ash rests on the stone. Someone burned incense there earlier. The scent is faint now, something between sandalwood and chrysanthemum, but it lingers. It always does. Inside the willow house is not grand. It is quiet, measured. It carries beauty the way a woman carries a secret, with grace and never all at once. Paper walls soften the sound of movement. Tatami mats cushion the steps. Candles burn slowly in their corners, watched by no one. And yet, the house feels watched. Somewhere near the back, behind two folding screens hand-painted with koi and peonies, a courtesan sleeps. Her room is modest. The futon is folded back slightly, just enough to suggest she stirred but didn't rise. Her hand rests above her head, fingers loose. Her hair has begun to fall from its careful pins. One red ribbon lies beside her, not draped, not lost, just placed. The scent of camellia oil clings to the pillow. A cup of green tea, now cold, sits untouched. On the wooden shelf near the wall, a folded kimono waits. Indigo, heavy with embroidery. It was worn earlier that evening during a dance, but now it rests as she does. As the house does, she is not dreaming. Not yet. The night is still too awake for that. Outside her door, the floorboards creak. Not from footsteps, but from memory. The air inside the willow house is old, and it hums with the weight of things that have happened before. Each breath of wind through the shoshi screens sounds like a name being whispered, but never finished. This is not a tale of beauty. It is not a tale of tragedy. It is a tale of waiting, of listening, of drifting down into something softer than memory. They called her Suri, though that was not the name she was born with. Like many women behind these painted doors, she had been renamed, not cruelly, but carefully, as if history itself agreed to forget. In the willow house, names were folded like letters, hidden inside sleeves, burned when necessary. The guests have all gone. The music, soft plucked strings, the hush of a drum, a breath behind a fan has stopped. In the far corner of the house, someone hums a lullaby in a dialect even the wind doesn't recognize. A song passed down from a grandmother who never learned to write. Suri stirs once, not awake, not quite. Her lips part. The red has worn off. Only the pale outline remains. Her eyes stay closed, but her breath deepens. As if sensing the night has changed, she does not know yet that tomorrow brings a choice. But the house knows. The willow house always knows. Outside her room, beside the garden, a basin catches rain from a bent bamboo pipe. The sound is steady, soothing, the kind of sound that slows the pulse without asking. A single koi swims lazy circles in the shallow pond beside it, unaware of anything but the moon. Above, the wind stirs the willow branches, and they answer not with rustling, but with a sigh. At, the kind only trees this old can make. The kind that comes after too many seasons of watching women pretend not to feel. Beyond the garden, a distant bell rings, soft, faint, perhaps from a nearby shrine, perhaps from a memory, and still Suri sleeps. She does not know that someone will knock at her screen door before dawn. She does not know that the knock will come from the herb mistress, the one who never walks loudly, who never looks anyone in the eye, who always smells faintly of crushed leaves. She does not know that the knock means something has begun, something small, something growing. But that is not this hour. This hour is for quiet, for stillness, for remembering the weight of silk and the way footsteps sound in empty halls. This is not a history lesson. It is a lullaby for her. For you. For the ones who once waited behind walls no one ever opened from the outside. Oh. What time is it there? Dim the lights. Let your thoughts loosen. Let your breath go quiet. The house will hold you. Sleep now. She will wake soon. And when she does, the night will begin again. The morning never truly arrives in the Willow House. Even when the sun touches the paper walls, it does so gently, as if asking permission. The light is soft, diffused, careful not to wake anything not yet ready to rise. Inside, everything moves slowly. The dust in the air, the shadows beneath the wooden beams. Silence that folds between breaths. She shifts her shoulders slightly, and the red silk curtain draped beside her bed sways with the motion. It is heavy, embroidered with gold cranes that seem to move in the dim morning glow. It hides nothing, really. Everyone in the house knows what lies behind the curtain, but still, it is drawn every night. Not for secrecy, for softness. For ritual. Her fingers touch the edge of the curtain. The silk is cool, slightly damp, perhaps from the closeness of her breath overnight. She draws it back. Slowly, the day doesn't need to rush. No one here ever rushes, not even the ones pretending to. Outside her room, the hallway lies empty. It always looks longer in the morning. Light trickles through slats in the wood, forming uneven lines along the floor. The smell of breakfast rice reaches her first. Delicate. Not strong. And behind it, the earthy trace of wet leaves just beyond the threshold. She slips one foot from beneath the blanket, letting it rest on the mat. The floor is cool, but not unpleasant. Her anklet makes no sound. She hasn't worn it since the night before last. It's still there, beside the basin, wrapped in a white cloth that someone folded too carefully to be a mistake. She stands without noise. Her kimono, folded neatly on a small stool, waits for her. She doesn't put it on, not yet. Instead, she reaches for the inner robe. Soft aged, a pale cream that's begun to yellow at the seams. She drapes it over her shoulders, wraps it twice around her waist, and knots it with little thought. Her hands move from memory. The mirror in her room is not glass, but polished metal. It catches light strangely, as if remembering every face it's ever seen. She does not look into it, not yet. She runs a comb through her hair with steady, deliberate strokes. Pins will come later, so will the color. So for now, she'll just combs. Red silk still clings to the air. Not from the curtain, from something deeper, a memory of it, the way it moved last night. The way it brushed against her shoulder when she turned toward the screen, the sound it made, like a breath drawn in, but never let go. Downstairs, the house has begun to wake. Someone slides a shoji door open. A kettle whistles once, then is silenced. The rhythm of cloth being wrung out echoes faintly, followed by footsteps padded in socks. Soft voices begin to pass. Not full words, just tones, gestures wrapped in air. She moves through the hallway without urgency. Each board beneath her remembers her weight, her presence, her pacing. She does not disturb the quiet. She is part of it. When she reaches the rear veranda, she pauses. The garden lies in half shadow, dew still clinging to the stones. A small frog rests near the edge of the pond, unmoved by her gaze. The willow branches sway slightly, even without wind, as if they too are stretching slowly awake. She kneels beside the basin and dips her fingers into the water. It's colder than she expected. She lets the chill hold her a moment longer before bringing it to her face. No gasp, no reaction, just the stillness of cold across her skin. A reminder that the day has begun. In the room behind her, someone clears their throat. A soft knock follows. 3 taps, then silence. She does not turn. She knows the knock. It isn't a summons, it's a message. That breakfast is waiting. That the dressing room is ready. That today will be like the one before. But today is not like the one before. The red silk curtain is still drawn open. She hasn't tied it back. She rises, wraps her robe tighter, steps once more into the house. And the koi below the basin flicks its tail. Once, sending small ripples through water that, until now, had forgotten how to move. The corridors of the Willow House were never empty. Even when no one walked them, they held the sound of movement, soft, purposeful, memorized. The steps of women who had come before, long before Suri, still echoed in the grain of the floorboards. Some mornings she could almost hear them, as if someone had just turned the corner, as if a figure had just slipped past the paper door, robes brushing against her shoulder.
Oh.
Only there was no one. It was not haunting, it was not fear, it was rhythm. The painted steps of a courtesan were never allowed to be careless. Every motion, from bow to blink, had to be shaped, weighed, practiced until it became instinct. Even breathing was a performance. Inhaled softly through the nose, exhaled without movement of the shoulders, Sayuri had learned quickly. Not because she wanted to, but because the house required it. When she first watched the older women walk, she thought they were floating. Their slippers barely kissed the wood, their sleeves never caught, their obi never shifted. They moved like dancers with no stage. But it was not magic, it was repetition. In the dressing room, behind the third screen, she had practiced for hours, with rice paper balanced on her head, tea bowls in each hand, the madam's sharp voice correcting the slightest tremor in her wrist. "Not like that, Suri," she would say, as if the wind is watching. And so she walked, as if watched, always. Now, even in the quiet of morning, she could not walk without grace. Her feet remembered where to pause, where the floor bowed, where the steps must be slowest. Her movements had become part of the house's rhythm. The slippers she wore were painted by hand, crimson, with 2 gold peonies on the outer edge. They weren't hers, not truly. None of it was, but they fit well enough. As she stepped through the central corridor, her eyes stayed forward, not in pride. In habit, looking around was for guests. For the uncertain, the watch did not look. Behind the rice screen, she heard I am laughing, kind of laugh meant only for performance. A laugh shaped to comfort a man who did not know how to listen. Suri knew the sound well. She had used it the week before. It always rang slightly hollow to the women who heard it from behind walls. She did not stop walking. The painted steps carried her past the main parlor, past the orchid room, and toward the outer edge of the house, where the window slats opened slightly onto the back garden. There she paused. She liked this window. It was old, its wood faded, its screen torn faintly at the edge, just enough to glimpse the willow trunk below. Not the branches, not the drifting leaves, just the base, thick and still and sure. Some nights when sleep refused to come, she would kneel beside that window and press her fingers to the edge of the tier. It was not large, but enough to let in scent, earth, rain, dust from petals falling. No one else seemed to notice it, or if they did, they never said. She continued walking. Her slippers made the faintest sound, like paper folding. In the next hall, she passed another girl. It's one of the newer ones, still learning. She bowed too quickly. Her ribbon was crooked. Suri did not correct her. She simply nodded once, slow and calm. The girl blushed, as if seen for the first time. Suri remembered that blush. She had worn it once, too. At the end of the corridor, she reached her room. She paused again, fingers brushing the edge of the sliding door. The steps that brought her here were not her own. They were inherited, practiced, shaped by those who walked before her, who taught the house how to breathe. But now, they belonged to her. The Willow House did not speak, but it listened. And in the hush between footsteps, it remembered every woman who had walked its painted floors, especially the ones who never truly left. The room where Saruri prepared for the evening was narrow and warm, always filled with the faint scent of toasted rice and plum oil. The walls were lined with shallow wooden shelves, each one holding bowls, brushes, folded cloth, and tiny dishes filled with colors that looked dull until they touched the skin. No one spoke loudly in this room. The women who moved through it, dressing, combing, preparing, all seemed to understand that noise didn't belong here. The rustle of silk, the soft thump of a powder brush against the palm, the quiet clicking of a comb through damp hair, These were the only sounds allowed. Sayori sat in front of the mirror. The surface, a polished bronze oval edged in black lacquer, gave no sharp reflection. It blurred her face, softening her edges, turning her into someone she did not quite recognize. That was the point. Her reflection was never for her. Behind her, a girl with steady fingers tied the first layer of her robe. White cotton, freshly pressed. It clung slightly to her back from the warmth of the room. Sayori kept her gaze low, not out of modesty, but focus. Her thoughts moved slowly in this space. Always. To her left, a shallow tray of tea steamed faintly. Pale green, unstirred. She never drank it. It was placed there every evening by the housekeeper, and every evening it cooled beside her, untouched. Still, she liked its presence. The smell. The quiet warmth beside her elbow. Her hands rested palm down on her knees. Still waiting. She had long since learned to move only when necessary. The girl behind her reached for the face powder, a soft white paste that smelled faintly of crushed pearls. Using a brush made from rabbit hair, she swept it gently across Sayori's forehead, her cheeks down the bridge of her nose. It didn't feel like makeup. It felt like vanishing. Layer by layer, Sayori disappeared beneath tradition, beneath ritual, beneath something older than her own name. Her lips were the last to be touched. A tiny stick of red pigment dampened and pressed into the center of her mouth. No outline, just a bloom of color. Small, deliberate. The way a flower might open if told not to draw attention. Hair came next. Sayori's hair had always been long, but the house had taught her how to wear it. It's not simply pinned, but sculpted. Layered, lifted, dressed with combs of tortoiseshell and silk cords the color of night sky. The girl worked quickly, hands practiced. Not rough, not tender, just precise. Sayori kept breathing slow, not out of calm, but discipline. Fast breaths meant sweat, and sweat ruined powder. When the last pin was set, the girl stepped back without a word. Sayori rose. Her inner robe rustled softly. She moved to the rack where tonight's outer kimono waited, a deep violet. Nearly black in this light, embroidered with chrysanthemums, so pale they looked like frost. She did not dress herself. The robe was heavy. 2 women helped her into it. One lifted, the other wrapped. The obi, wide, stiff, the color of smoked gold, was tied with practiced hands. It settled against her lower back, tight enough to hold posture, loose enough not to bruise. Sayori stood still through it all, not out of obedience, but ritual. These movements were part of her now, part of the house. When they stepped back, she remained facing the mirror. Her face no longer looked like hers, but it wasn't someone else's either. It was a version of herself that belonged to the night. To the guests, to the unspoken contracts between those who watched and those who must never be fully seen. The door slid open behind her. Soft chime was struck. Once. It meant the first guest had arrived. Sayori turned. Not quickly, not slowly. Just enough to let the silk move like water around her ankles. She took 1 step forward. Then another. The powder did not flake. The tea had cooled, and outside the wind paused just long enough to let her pass. The first rain came just after sunset. Not heavy, but steady, like the sound of a brush drawn gently across parchment. It tapped softly against the paper screens, clung to the wooden eaves, and collected in the moss-lined grooves of the garden stones. In the willow house, no one rushed to close the windows. The rain was welcome. It quieted everything. Sayori stood in the entryway, just beyond the second hall, where lanterns hung low from the beams. Each one glowed with its own rhythm, pale, amber, soft ochre, the faintest shade of rose. Their paper skin had begun to wrinkle with damp. The light inside flickered, but did not die. Outside, the guests' sandals sat in tidy rows, the edges darkened from the wet. The clatter of a carriage wheel had faded a few moments earlier, and now the world outside felt paused, caught between footsteps. A man removed his outer coat by the entrance. He didn't speak. His movements were slow, practiced, the kind of silence that comes from returning somewhere you've been too many times. He didn't look at her, not directly. He looked at the lanterns. Suri bowed, a measured, graceful bend from the waist. Not too low. Just enough to offer acknowledgement without intimacy. The house taught such balance. To be warm but not available, present but distant. He followed the housekeeper toward the main room. Suri remained behind for a moment. Her robe felt heavier in the moisture. The silk clung slightly at the hem. It's not enough to trouble her walk, but enough to make her aware of her body, its shape, its weight, its silence. She made her way toward the western wing, past the hanging scroll of plum blossoms, past the wooden owl carved into the doorframe. A charm placed long ago by a madam no one remembered. She moved as she always did, carefully, rhythmically, with the sound of the house in her breath. The gathering room was lit with 5 lanterns, no more. Their glow made everything appear older, the wood grain deeper. The koto strings glimmered faintly in the shadows. Bowls of plums rested untouched on the low table, each arranged with intention, though no one ever asked who arranged them. Suri knelt on the cushion furthest from the door. Her sleeves flowed like still water across her lap. The man opposite her poured the tea. His hands were clean. His eyes were tired. He spoke of the weather, of the rain falling outside his shop earlier that day, of the way his roof leaked, just slightly, and how he let it leak. Believing some things are meant to remind us we still have roofs. Siri smiled faintly, a smile that meant, I hear you, not I understand. She poured his second cup. He watched the steam rise. He didn't drink it. Their conversation never touched names. It's not his, not hers. In this room, such details were considered loud. Everything spoken was filtered through softness, through glances, through pauses too long to measure. Outside, a bamboo branch scratched faintly against the window frame. The sound was delicate, like writing. The man leaned forward, his voice lowered. He told her a story, not a memory, but a dream. A woman standing in the rain, waiting for a train that never arrived. He wasn't in the dream. Said he only heard it once and never forgot it. Suri nodded. She had heard hundreds of dreams. Some repeated, some invented, some offered like apologies. This one felt different. Not for its content, but its delivery. He spoke as if afraid the room would reject it. She refilled the cup. He finally drank. The night deepened. The rain thickened. Somewhere behind the far wall, someone plucked 2 low notes on the shamisen, then stopped. Not a performance. It's just a reminder that the house was listening. Suri stood when the bell chimed twice, the sign that the hour was near its end. The man did not rise right away. He studied her robe, not her, but the fabric, as if trying to memorize the pattern. She said nothing. Neither did he. When he finally stood, he bowed, slightly longer than expected. He stepped backward instead of turning. Only once he reached the door did he glance back. Not for her, it's for the lanterns. Suri walked the hall again, slower now. The silk behind her whispered with every step. She paused once, beneath the final lantern, the one nearest the door. Its flame trembled, not from the wind, from the weight of the air. And in that flicker, just for a moment, it felt as though someone was still standing behind her. The morning passed without speaking, within the willow house. Not all days began with words. Some began with the quiet sorting of thoughts, the gentle folding of cloth, and the almost invisible work of putting oneself back together. Suri moved through her rituals slowly, not to delay the day, but because there was no reason to rush toward what she already knew. She slipped into her softer robe, the one reserved for times between duties, not for guests, not for sleep. It was the color of damp ash, lined with old silk that had grown thin at the seams. It had never been beautiful, but it carried no weight, and in that it was precious. The hallway outside her room was still. A tray of steamed rice and pickled plum had been left near her door. She lifted it without sound, carried it back inside, and sat cross-legged beside the window where the bamboo leaned in close. The rain had ended sometime before dawn. Now only droplets fell, slow and lazy, from the curved tips of the leaves. She ate without thought, her fingers working the chopsticks with practiced care. Each bite was small, measured. She never finished the plum. No one ever did. It was there for tradition, not hunger. From the far end of the house came the faint sound of fabric snapping, someone airing a futon. Then the creak of the outer gate, followed by footsteps that paused near the front room and didn't continue. Guests, perhaps, or deliveries. The house didn't react, neither did she. Once the tray was placed aside, Suri knelt again at the basin. This time, she washed not to wake, but to mark the moment. The way monks strike a bell not to call anyone, but simply to acknowledge the passing of breath. Her hands moved slowly through the water, stirring only the surface. When she rose, she opened the small cloth pouch left by the herb mistress. The dried leaves inside had darkened slightly with the humidity. She pinched the correct amount, no more, never less, and placed it into a small cup with boiled water drawn fresh that morning. It steeped fast. The color turned dark and earthy. She didn't drink it right away. She watched it, as if it might speak. It never did. But she drank it slowly, the bitterness pressing into her tongue, then her throat, then her stomach, where it settled with the weight of something chosen long ago. There had been no discussion, no questions, no ceremonies. It was simply how things were done. No child could be allowed to live in the willow house. Not out of cruelty, but preservation. The guests came for illusions, for beauty uninterrupted. There was no room for permanence. Sayuri understood this. She didn't fight it, but that didn't mean it didn't stay with her. The knowledge, the stillness, and the memory of what it meant every time she prepared the cup. She placed it back on the table, the last sip still clinging to the edge. Outside, a bird called out once, then fell quiet. She turned her head slowly toward the window and let her breath leave her in silence. No tears, no hesitation, only the soft, unchanging rhythm of the house. Somewhere a bell rang once, not to summon. Just to remind, time was still passing. She stepped into the garden barefoot, the stones still slick from last night's rain. No one was watching. Not at this hour. Not in this corner of the house. Robe trailed slightly behind her, gathering a faint dusting of dew where it brushed against the moss. The air was quiet but thick. Not heavy, only full, as if it carried too much memory in too small a space. The willow tree stood at the edge of the path, its long branches reaching down like strands of hair not yet combed. Sayuri reached out, not to take anything, but to touch. Her fingers met the leaves as if greeting a friend she saw only when it rained. The branch moved slowly, without protest. Beneath the tree, the soil was darker, softer, as though it remembered something no one else did. She crouched there, not to pray, not to mourn, just to be close to the ground. Beneath her feet she felt the quiet pulse of the earth. Not a sound, not a movement, but an echo. A reminder, kind that stays under the skin, long after the moment has ended. She remembered a night from years ago, before the willow house, before the silk and the painted steps. A night when the wind had torn the shutters from the kitchen in her mother's home. She had been woken not by fear, but by the sudden absence of her mother's singing. The song had always come with the fire's crackle, but that night, silence. It had unnerved her more than the wind. That silence was the first thing she had ever been taught to obey. Now in the garden, she felt it again, but different. Not threatening, not hollow, just complete. Behind her, a door slid open. Soft steps followed. Sayuri didn't turn. The sound was familiar, lighter than most. She knew it was Aiko, one of the quieter girls, still new, but observant. The one who always folded her sleeve cuffs twice, even when she didn't need to. "You always come here," Aiko said, voice barely above the breeze. She wasn't asking, just stating. Sayuri nodded once, still kneeling. Her hand remained in the grass. Aiko stepped closer, not beside her, but behind. A respectful distance. She knelt carefully. The silence between them stretched, long and unbroken. "I think about it too," she said after some time. "What it would be like if one stayed." Sayuri said nothing. She didn't have to. The garden was already full of unspoken things. Aiko leaned forward, her fingers brushing the same leaves Saria had touched moments earlier. "I heard the herb mistress once had a daughter," she whispered, "before she came here." Saria looked down at the soil, the color of it, the shape it held. A faint depression where water had pooled, now dried. The ground never truly forgets what it held. She never speaks of it, Aiko added, voice even lower. No one does, Sayuri said at last. That's how we keep going. Aiko didn't reply. She stayed there, hands in her lap, eyes low. The wind shifted and a few leaves danced against their sleeves. The koi in the pond stirred. One slow ripple. Sayuri stood. Legs ached from kneeling, but she didn't show it. She turned toward the path and walked back toward the house, steps steady, robe trailing quietly behind her. Aiko remained kneeling under the tree, staring at the place Sayuri's hands had touched. The branches swayed above her, but the willow, as always, said nothing at all. The hallway had dried from the morning mist, but it still smelled of rain, that soft, comforting dampness that lived in the wood itself. Not wet, but full, like old breaths trapped beneath lacquer in time. Sayuri moved through it without sound, her robe brushing the walls as she turned the corners, passing empty rooms that still carried the memory of voices. Each door she passed was familiar. The second one on the left held a scroll painted with cranes. The room across it was where Ayam had once kept a hidden mirror from her childhood, buried beneath folded robes. Even now, after Ayam had long gone, Sayuri sometimes imagined she could hear the mirror being uncovered. The breath of memory released as a robe was moved just slightly too far to the side. She arrived at the tea room just before the sun had fully crested the outer wall. The light came in angled and soft, golden through the thin screen. It painted the tatami in long, pale streaks that moved when the breeze lifted the edges of the curtain. The tea had already been poured. A small, shallow cup sat in its place, steam rising gently, though the water had not been freshly boiled. Someone had prepared it moments before, likely the housekeeper. She always moved ahead of everyone like a shadow with hands. Sayuri sat without adjusting her robe. She let it fall the way it wanted, allowed her sleeves to rest unevenly. The room was private. She didn't have to hold her shape here. She lifted the cup, held it in both hands, and breathed in the warmth. The scent was familiar. Roasted barley, faint, earthy, calming. She didn't drink, just held it there, her fingers wrapped around the warmth like it was a heartbeat. The curtain moved again. She didn't look up. The breeze touched her cheek and pulled a few strands of hair loose from the back of her neck. She left them there. A voice came from the doorway. Low, male. It's always barley with you. She looked up slowly. The man was not in full robes. He wore a simple, houri, deep brown, the sleeves rolled slightly at the wrist. His sandals had been removed at the door neatly, the way only someone familiar with the house would do. She didn't speak. He stepped into the room, not as a guest, but as someone returning to a place he didn't quite claim. He sat across from her, cross-legged, his back straight. You don't remember me? He said. She tilted her head slightly. Not to agree or disagree, just to listen. Years ago, he said, I watched you serve tea to a man who talked more to the wall than to you. She let a faint breath move from her nose. That could be many men. He smiled at that. A small, crooked thing. It's the kind of smile made by someone who rarely used their mouth to say what they felt. He reached for the other cup, the one no one had touched. It had gone cold. He drank anyway. I used to come here to forget, he said. Now I come because I'm afraid of forgetting too much. Sayuri watched the steam from her cup fade. Most men come here for forgetting. Do you? He asked. The question lingered in the air. I come here because there is nowhere else left to be, she said. He nodded, not surprised. He placed the cup down gently. I left something with you once, he said. Her eyes shifted to the edge of the room, where a folded cloth rested against the wall, pale blue, with threads of copper running through it. She had kept it there for 3 years, never opened it, never moved it. She hadn't remembered who it belonged to. Until now, he looked at it, then back at her. He never burned it. She shook her head. I thought you might come back. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was soft, worn. The kind that slips into place when two people realize they've already said everything that matters, just not in the same room or at the same time. Outside, the wind pushed through the garden again. The willow tree leaned, and inside the house, time folded gently into itself. Not backward, not forward. He didn't ask to touch the cloth, didn't reach for it, simply looked at it with the kind of reverence men rarely showed for things they had once forgotten. Suri didn't move it either. There was something sacred about the space between them. It's the air holding the memory gently as if any gesture would tear it open. She set her teacup down beside hers. The sound was barely audible, a tiny note of porcelain on wood. "It wasn't mine to keep," she said, her voice calm, her eyes steady on the fabric. "It wasn't mine to leave," he replied, slower now, "but I did." The words held no drama, no apology, only truth. That quiet kind that doesn't change anything but softens what was once sharp. Suri reached for her sleeve and folded it over her wrist, tucking her fingers out of sight. Her posture straightened a little, not in pride, in containment. There were things still untold, and the body always carried them before the voice ever did. "When you left," she said softly, "I was wearing white. It was raining." He closed his eyes for a moment, not to picture it, to absorb it. "I remember the sound of your sandals," she added, the way they paused at the gate, then kept walking. "I didn't mean for it to be the last time. It wasn't," she said, "not for me." The breeze returned, pushing against the paper screen. One edge lifted and then settled again. The light in the room shifted with it. Shadows moved to the other wall. They sat in silence for what felt like a long time. The kind of silence that didn't need to end. Finally, he spoke again. "I saw you once, a year later, in the marketplace." "You didn't see me. I did," she said. His eyes met hers. They didn't widen, just deepened, like the surface of water when it begins to reflect something beneath it. "I had nothing left to give you," he said. "Not even my name." Siri shook her head just once. "I never asked for your name," she said. "Only that you stay long enough to remember mine." He smiled again, a softer one this time. "Siri," he said, and this time it wasn't a memory. It was a presence. She bowed her head slightly, and when she raised it, her eyes didn't move from his. "You were the first man who ever looked at me and saw someone who had already been someone. I saw someone who didn't need to be saved," he said, "but I still wanted to try." Her shoulders relaxed, and her hands still folded, loosened just slightly. They didn't speak again. Not because the conversation was over, but because the silence between them had changed shape. He stood slowly adjusting the fold of his robe. She rose with him. They faced each other only a few breaths apart. Not touching, not remembering aloud, just standing in the same moment. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "You'll keep it?" he asked, nodding toward the folded cloth. Siri looked at it. The copper thread caught the light. "No," she said, "but I won't burn it either." He nodded once, then stepped out of the room. His footsteps faded into the long hallway, absorbed by the wood, by the years, by the house that always knew how to listen. Sayori remained standing, her hands at her sides, her body still. The tea had gone cold, still it gave off warmth. The corridor was empty again. The kind of empty that didn't feel lonely, only quiet. Suri walked its length without thinking, her feet bare against the worn floorboards, each step finding the smoothest path by memory alone. The house had many ways of holding silence, and this, the after-silence, was one of the deepest. She paused near the side alcove, where the calligraphy scroll changed with the seasons. Today's bore, a single character inked in faint pale strokes. It meant endure, though it could also mean hold. In the Willow House, words often had more than one meaning. They stretched themselves across the walls like shadows. Real, but always shifting. The hallway turned left, and with it, Suri followed. Past the kitchens, where the scent of steamed millet drifted faintly from a pot someone had left on low heat, no fire crackled. The kitchen girls were elsewhere now, scrubbing floors, folding linens, preparing trays that would not be used until dusk. She slipped into the laundry room through the back entrance. No one noticed. The steam from rinsed robes still hung in the air, clouding the small window that overlooked the alley. The scent was different. Starch, damp cotton, the faint bitterness of soap root. Suri crossed the room to a small drawer tucked beside the cupboard. She pulled it open, careful not to let the wood creak, and removed a folded square of cloth. Plain gray, nearly featureless. Its side was a hairpin. Simple. Bone-colored. Carved with a single wave at one end. It wasn't valuable. Not to anyone else. But she had worn it the first time she danced before an audience, not a guest. A festival. The lanterns had been everywhere that night, hanging from ropes strung between houses, from trees, even from the edge of the shrine gate. She had danced with her eyes low, her arms raised, her face painted too brightly, her sleeves too long. But the pin had held, it had not slipped. And somehow, that had meant everything. She held it in her hand now, her fingers pressing lightly against the smooth surface. She didn't need to wear it. It wasn't that kind of day. She tucked it into her sleeve and closed the drawer. When she returned to the hallway, the light had shifted. Afternoon had arrived, soft and hazy. The edges of the shoshi screens glowed with that golden color that only lasted an hour. The hour the house seemed to hold its breath. Suri turned into the guest room no longer used. The tatami was still in place, the cushions neatly stacked. But no tray had been set, no fan left behind. It was a room that waited, not for people, but for decisions. She closed the door gently behind her and sat near the wall. Her knees tucked beneath her, sleeves pooling around her hands. In the center of the room sat the folded cloth he had once left her, pale blue, threaded with copper. Not because she wished to hide it, but because here it would not be disturbed. She opened it now, slowly. The fabric unfolded with a soft sound, like breath released after holding too long. Inside, wrapped tightly, was the second pin. Its twin, carved from the same bone, shaped with the same wave. She placed the one from her sleeve beside it. For a long time, she did not move. Not out of grief, not from longing, but because there was something holy in the stillness. Outside the room, the wind began to rise again. Not strong, not sharp. Just enough to rustle the willow leaves in long, sweeping motions. A sound like pages turning. Suri leaned forward and closed the cloth, folding the pins together. She did not tie it. She did not hide it. She placed it in the center of the room, letting it remain as it was, as it had been, as it might never be again. And then she rose, stepped backward, and slid the door open.
Ouch.
Letting the light fall across the tatami once more. Evening crept in with the hush of old slippers, the kind no one hears until they've already passed. The willow house changed at this hour, not loudly, not all at once, but in ways that could be felt beneath the skin. The air turned warmer inside, cooler just beyond the screens. Shadows lengthened with purpose. Candles were lit not to illuminate, but to remind the walls that night had begun again. Suri walked slowly through the inner corridor, where the lanterns were being raised by hand. Each one, brushed lightly with fresh oil, glowed a little brighter than before. The girl tending them, small, younger, with a loose braid down her back, gave Suri a gentle nod. No words. Words could break the fragile surface of this hour. Down the far end, past the curtain rooms and the painted fans. Suri entered the room where robes were kept for evening wear. The attendant had already arranged 3 choices. One in soft jade, one in pale plum, and one in a shade of red that leaned toward, rust-aged but proud. She let her hand rest on the plum. It was the quietest, the least likely to be remembered. She let the robe slip over her shoulders with practiced ease. The fabric was cool against her arms, and the lining brushed her collarbone like breath. She reached for the sash herself, tightly, but with just enough firmness to remind herself. She was still shaped by her own hands. The dressing room mirror caught her face in that fading gold light. She stared only long enough to settle her expression. It's not a mask. Not entirely. But the version of herself that belonged to guests and candles and names she would forget by morning. She applied the rouge with light fingers, pressed powder across her cheeks, shaped her lips into that small blooming red that didn't reach the edges. The smile she wore would be formed later by the room, by the company, by the rhythm of each conversation. Her hair had not yet been redressed. She left it partially loose, the strands falling like ink behind her shoulders. Only one pin, the simpler one, was tucked into place. It wasn't tradition. It wasn't protocol. It was simply what felt right, in the hall. The other women had begun to gather, quietly. Each moved as if listening to something unheard, something that passed between the walls before a guest ever stepped inside. Suri joined them without announcement, her feet gliding across the floor, the scent of plum trailing softly in her wake. They lined the main parlor like petals arranged with purpose. Guests would arrive soon. House would breathe in again, pull tight at the seams, and begin its nightly ritual of grace and unspoken trade. Sayori found her place at the edge of the room, near the corner where the lantern always burned slightly lower. She liked this spot. It gave her just enough shadow to watch without being watched. A bell sounded in the entryway. Once, then again. The door opened, not wide, just enough. The first guest stepped in, shoes removed, eyes half tired, half curious. The scent of sake and travel clung to his sleeves. Behind him, another followed. Tit, and another. The parlor filled, not with sound, but with the careful murmur of expectation. Suri folded her hands in her lap, tucked one foot behind the other, and let her breath slow. For a moment paused, and then, as it always did, began to perform its soft, beautiful forgetting. The sound of poured tea filled the parlor. Not rushed, not accidental. A measured stream from lacquered pot to cup, each pour followed by the faintest clink of ceramic, barely audible beneath the hum of half-finished sentences and the flutter of a paper fan. Suri sat angled toward the center of the room, sleeves arranged just so, hands resting with intention. Presence, like the others, was crafted. Not false, but filtered. The guest before her was older, his hair tied back neatly, though the tie had begun to loosen as the night wore on. He smiled often, but only with his mouth. His eyes drifted when he spoke, as if searching for something long since left behind. Suri responded to him with nods, with soft laughter placed like petals between his words, never stealing attention but keeping him anchored. He complimented her grace, her voice, her stillness. She accepted the praise as a vase accepts water, filled but unchanged. Compliments were currency here, not owed, not kept, only passed from hand to hand, never spoken of again. In the far corner, another guest recited a verse. It's not original, not new. A poem repeated in too many rooms over too many years. Still, the women listened. They smiled. They applauded gently, not for the poem but for the effort. That too was ritual. Suri rose when the third tray arrived. She stood not all at once, but like a leaf unsticking from water. Her steps toward the guests were soundless, her robe gliding like smoke. She refilled his cup without breaking eye contact, watched her hand more than her face. She was used to that. He asked if she was from the north. She said no. He asked if she had ever danced on festival nights. She said once long ago. He asked if she missed anything. She paused. Not long. Just long enough. I forget the names of things I once missed, she said, her voice like candlelight. He didn't speak after that. Just drank slowly. A round of laughter erupted across the room. 2 guests over. Didn't reach them. They stayed within their quieter silence, shared like a folded cloth between them. The music began. Not loud. A koto string, low and wandering. The drum tapped once, then waited. Suri recognized the pattern. It was the sound used when guests had stayed longer than expected, when the mood needed softening. She sat again, folding her legs beneath her. Her hands found each other in her lap. The silk of her sleeves warmed under the lantern light. The guest looked at her, not with longing, not with want, but with a kind of still recognition. You remind me of someone, he said. I often do, she replied. He smiled, not in amusement, in understanding. Later, when the hour deepened and the guests stood to leave, robes gathered, sandals retrieved, laughter quieter now. Sayori remained kneeling until the last had stepped into the night. The parlor emptied. The lanterns flickered. A few cushions were left crooked, a fan forgotten near the tray. The women rose one by one, their voices returning to whispers that carried no meaning, only shape. Suri walked the room slowly, smoothing the mats where guests had sat. She refolded one robe left across the bench. She gathered 2 stray teacups and placed them near the tray. She did not sigh. She did not smile. She simply moved as she always had, as part of the house, as part of the hush, as part of the memory of another night that would soon slip gently beneath the surface. And somewhere beyond the screens, the willow shifted its weight again, watching, listening, remembering. The night deepened until even the lanterns seemed to breathe slower. Most of the women had returned to their rooms, their steps light, their laughter left behind with the wine. Mats had been straightened, sleeves folded, combs laid to rest on small trays beside pillows, that would not know real sleep. The willow house always held stillness better than it held dreams. Suri lingered near the back veranda, standing where the floor gave way to stone and the garden pressed close. The wind had returned, but only in the highest branches of the willow, swaying gently, too far to touch. She rested her hand on the wooden frame of the door, leaning just slightly, eyes drawn to the path that curved around the koi pond. A single paper lantern still floated on the water, placed there during the last festival and never retrieved. It had tipped once, caught a breeze, but somehow remained upright, a stubborn, glowing thing that refused to sink. Behind her, a soft step, not hurried, not cautious, familiar. The housekeeper moved into view, holding a folded shawl. "You'll catch the cold," she murmured, voice lined with age, but not unkindness. Suri nodded, letting the shawl be placed around her shoulders. The warmth wasn't needed, but the gesture was. "He's left," the housekeeper said. "I know." Sayori didn't turn her head. She could still smell his presence on the air. A hint of dried plum and old parchment. He had touched nothing, taken nothing, and yet somehow something had shifted after he walked through the door. "He asked if you still remembered the song," the housekeeper added. Sayori looked toward the pond. "I do," she said, "but not the words. Only the way the notes sat in my throat." The housekeeper paused beside her, eyes narrowing against the wind. Maybe that's enough. They stood there together a while longer, not speaking, listening instead to the low hum of water against stone and the distant creak of wood settling above their heads. When the housekeeper left, Suri didn't move. She waited until the moonlight touched the edge of the veranda. Then, slowly, she stepped down onto the stone path barefoot, her shawl trailing behind her. The earth was cool, but not unfriendly. It accepted her weight with a quiet ease, as though it had always known she would walk here tonight. She knelt by the pond. The floating lantern spun once, pushed by the faintest ripple. Suri reached out, not to catch it, but to feel the movement of water on her fingers. Her reflection wavered in the surface, broken gently by the ripples, as if even the water knew not to show too much. In the reflection, the willow tree swayed above her, long branches dipping low, heavy with memory. She closed her eyes and let her fingers rest in the water. Time did not stop. It simply softened, the kind of softness that fills a room when nothing is left to be said, the kind that lives between footsteps after parting, the kind that returns only when the house is finally quiet again, and the world for just a little while agrees to keep its voice low. She rose from the pond slowly, water clinging to her fingertips in cool threads. The night wrapped around her like cloth knots, suffocating, not cold, just present. As she stepped back onto the wooden veranda, her footfalls made no sound. The willow house did not mind her movement. It had grown used to the quiet shapes she made. She did not return to her room, not yet. Instead, she turned down the corridor leading to the old chamber, the one no longer used. A room that once belonged to someone no one spoke of, yet everyone remembered. The paper screen at the entrance had been mended years ago, but the repair line still showed, a faint scar of torn paper stitched with care. Inside, the room remained empty. No cushions, no scrolls, no tray. Only the open window where the wind passed through without hesitation. She stepped into that stillness, the shawl falling from her shoulders as she moved to the center and knelt. Her hands folded gently in her lap, her head bowed, not in prayer. There were stories of the woman who once lived in this room. Some said she left in the middle of the night carrying a lantern and a child wrapped in red silk. Others said she had never left at all, that she was simply moved somewhere deeper in the house. Her name folded into the walls like a secret no one dared unfold. Sayori did not know which was true. What she did know was this. The room held breath. It held memory. It listened. She reached into her sleeve and removed the small cloth from earlier, the one with the twin hairpins still inside. She opened it slowly, one fold at a time. No rush, no sound. The pins lay side by side now, their smooth surfaces catching only a thread of moonlight from the window. Sayori did not place them on display. She did not return them to her sleeve. She simply rested them on the floor in front of her and sat. The air in the room changed, not colder, not darker, just stiller, as if something unspoken had arrived. A creak from above. somewhere in the rafters. Now the kind the house only makes when everyone else is asleep. Sori let her hands fall to her knees, palms down. Her eyes stayed open, but her gaze softened, no longer fixed on anything outside of thought. She remembered a time before names were changed, before her steps were measured, before tea was poured with perfect silence. She remembered laughter that came from the belly, not the mouth. She remembered running barefoot through rice stalks so tall they bent to greet her. She remembered someone singing in the kitchen off-key, off-tempo, but never off-heart. And then, just as the wind passed again through the window, she felt it. A presence. Not someone. Not spirit. Just the sense that the house had paused again to watch her, not to judge, to remember. Sori gathered the cloth and folded it once more. She did not hide it away. She left it there, just beyond the edge of the moonlight, resting against the floor like something that belonged to the room itself. She stood, slowly, straightened her robe, lifted her shawl from the floor, and stepped back into the corridor, where the lanterns had dimmed to their lowest glow. Her room was still ahead, waiting. But tonight, she would walk slower, let each breath carry its full shape, let the quiet have room to follow her. Behind her, the door to the old chamber slid closed on its own, caught by a breeze or a breath. It didn't matter which. The willow house had heard what it needed to. The hallway seemed longer now, as it always did when Siri walked it alone. Not because the house had changed, but because certain silences stretched wider than others, especially the ones that followed remembrance. Her fingers brushed the smooth wood of the wall as she moved, not to steady herself, but to feel the grain. The house had a heartbeat, and it pulsed through that wood like a slow, steady drum only she could hear. Her room waited at the end, a soft square of light barely visible beneath the paper door. The candle inside had not gone out, though it had burned low. The flame bent gently, like it was waiting for her breath to decide whether to let it stay or send it off. She entered without ceremony. The room welcomed her, unchanged. Her futon lay untouched, pillow still pressed in the corner where she had leaned earlier that afternoon. The comb on the small table glimmered faintly beside the teacup, still marked by the last sip she hadn't taken. Nothing had moved, yet everything felt slightly different. She crossed the room and knelt beside the futon, pressing her hand once against the mat. The texture was warm from the house's breath, not from use. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders again, pooling around her arms like water. She reached for the comb, not to groom herself, but to hold something familiar. Her fingers traced each tooth slowly, pausing where the wood had splintered slightly years ago. That chip had always caught at her hair, and she had never smoothed it down. It was a flaw she had come to rely on. Outside the room, a hush passed through the corridor. No footsteps, no creaks, like stillness sweeping the space like a long exhale through cloth. Sori set the comb down and lay back, robe still wrapped around her. The ceiling above her was dark, but not blank. In the flicker of the candle, it moved. Shadows of the willow's outer branches reached across the beams, their long fingers curling and uncurling. Cast by wind that couldn't reach her but still wanted to be known, she watched them, not with fear, not with hope, just watched. Her breath slowed, her limbs softened. She was no longer holding herself in posture, no longer arranging her hands to please the room. She was simply a shape again, a girl again, a woman, perhaps, but mostly a breath, resting inside a house that had learned the art of carrying what others could not. The flame of the candle bent lower now, almost ready. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she did not imagine a future. She did not replay a past. She simply floated at the edge of stillness, the kind that waits at the bottom of sleep, the kind that lives behind the curtain, where even memory goes quiet, the kind the willow house had always known how to offer without question, without demand, only silence, only breath, only night. She didn't dream, not in the way people think of dreaming. No scenes, no words. Only the faint sensation of being carried somewhere soft, somewhere slow. Time loosened its grip in sleep, letting her drift between layers of quiet that had no beginning or end. There were no doors in that place, no footsteps. Only the warmth of breath held in still air, and the sense that someone, long ago, had slept just like this, The candle burned itself out while she lay there. It gave no smoke, no final flare. Just a soft folding into nothing, as though it had never been lit at all. The darkness it left behind was complete, but not empty. It held shape. It held memory. The willow house did not sleep. Never had. Even in the deepest hours of the night, the beams above her head remembered. The floor remembered. The paper. Screens remembered every voice that had ever passed through them. Every whisper, every breath, a breeze stirred. Faint and chilled from beneath the wooden frame of the outer wall. It carried no sound, only the scent of water still lingering from the pond outside. It touched the edge of Sayuri's sleeve, cooled the back of her neck, and then passed on. As if it had come only to see whether she was still there. She shifted once in her sleep. Not a turn, not a reach. Just a settling, like the house itself, letting her rest deeper. Her fingers curled slightly inward, her face softened. The line between her brow, always faintly held during the day, melted into stillness. Outside, the willow stirred. Its branches brushed across each other in slow, sweeping arcs, as if combing the night for forgotten thoughts. A single leaf broke loose and fell, spiraling through the air until it landed on the edge of the pond. It's floating there as weightless as silence. No one saw it. No one needed to. The world outside had folded in on itself. The lanterns had dimmed. The guests had gone. The dishes had been washed and stacked, the curtains drawn. Nothing called out. Nothing waited. The willow house breathed in and did not exhale. Suri's body sank slightly into the futon, the weight of her robe holding her, like a second skin. Her mouth parted slightly, just enough to draw in the soft rhythm of sleep, and in that hour, it's the one that comes just before the sky begins to hint at light, everything paused. The memories, the names, the performances, even the thoughts she hadn't meant to keep. They all went still, not forgotten, just allowed to rest in somewhere within her, in a place no voice had ever reached. Something small and quiet was finally given permission to let go. A faint grayness had begun to bloom along the edge of the sky, a kind of early morning light that did not belong to day or night, only to that sacred moment in between. The willow house stirred, not with motion, but with awareness. The beams tightened in their joints. The paper walls, touched by the first breath of dawn, became translucent. And beneath the floor, the silence began to thin. Suri had not yet opened her eyes. Her body remained still, resting in the soft shape it had settled into hours before. But her breath had changed. It had deepened, drawn longer now, no longer floating in dream. She was returning not to waking, not yet, but to something more present. The air in her room was cooler now. Fine mist of morning moisture had slipped through the seams of the wood, brushing lightly over the edge of her futon. Her robe had loosened in sleep. One sleeve lay open at her side like a petal waiting to be lifted. She stirred slowly. One hand found the floor first, her fingers pressing into the mat as if to ask it if it was still there. The house answered with warmth, familiar, undemanding. Her eyes opened without urgency. They did not search. They simply allowed the ceiling to come back into view, the same pattern of dark wooden beams. The faint line where the paper panel had once been repaired. The ripple of shadow cast by the willow branch outside her window. Everything was as it had been, and yet not entirely. She sat up without a sound. Her hair had come loose in sleep, strands draped over her shoulder and caught in the fabric at her waist. She untangled them gently with her fingers, working through each, not as if winding a thread back onto its spool. From outside, she heard the first sounds of the garden waking, a low trill from a hidden bird, the faint trickle of water being released into the pond by the bamboo fountain, the kind of sounds that did not interrupt silence, but stretched it wider. She folded her hands in her lap, the sleeves of her robe falling softly over her wrists. The light touched her cheek, pale, silver. Not yet golden, this was the hour she loved most. Not the hours of performance, or sleep, or laughter wrapped in ritual. But this, when the house was between breaths, when nothing was expected, when no name needed to be worn. She stood, slowly letting the robe fall from her shoulders and folding it with care. The cotton lining still held her warmth. She placed it near the basin, then reached for the inner robe hung beside the door. It smelled faintly of clean water and pressed lavender. No steps had passed her room yet. No voices murmured beyond the hallway. The world had not noticed she was awake, and in that gentle forgetfulness, she moved freely. She opened the shoshi screen and stepped into the corridor. The wood beneath her feet was cool, but dry. The air was brighter here. Morning had reached the heart of the house, even if no one had called it by name yet. She walked toward the veranda. Her steps slow, unguarded, each one guided by muscle memory. The garden greeted her. Dew clung to every leaf, and the willow tree stood still, as though it too had just woken. The pond's surface was smooth, mirroring the faint sky above. She knelt at the edge, its palms on her thighs, spine straight, and breathed in. The house had survived another night, so had she. And for now, that was enough. A soft clatter came from somewhere. Deep within the house, a tray being set too firmly, or perhaps a kettle brushed against a low shelf. The first signs of life, not disruptive, only distant. Suori remained still at the edge of the garden, eyes resting on the curve of the pond, where a single fish moved lazily beneath the surface. Its tail barely stirred the water, sending quiet ripples toward the stone. This hour would not last. She knew that. Soon the rooms would fill again. Footsteps would return. Names would be spoken, not hers, not truly, but the one the house had given her. Paint would touch her lips again. Robes would wrap around her body, layer upon layer, until her shape no longer belonged to her alone, but not yet. Now, there was only breath, only light, climbing gently over the garden wall, golden now, warmer than it had been when she awoke. It painted the pond in delicate lines and caught on the rim of her sleeve, giving her the brief illusion of shimmer. She dipped her fingers into the water beside her. It was cool, but not cold, and the fish didn't flee. It hovered beneath her, touch, sensing her presence without fear. A voice echoed softly from the corridor behind her, another woman's voice, calling to someone unseen, the kind of mourning voice that hadn't yet fully returned from sleep. Sayori didn't respond. The voice wasn't meant for her. She rose slowly, letting the air settle back where her body had knelt. Her feet padded softly across the wooden veranda. As she re-entered the house, the garden fading behind her like a page gently turned. Inside, the rooms had begun to shift. A pair of sandals had been moved near the entryway. Robe folded on a stool now waited for someone's hands. She passed a screen that had been left slightly open and paused, her fingers brushing the edge. Through the gap, she could see the sunlight, hitting the wall in soft angles, forming the shape of the window slats. A simple pattern, ordinary, yet for some reason, it held her attention longer than it should. Moments like these had become precious, unmarked by routine, unclaimed by memory, just breath, just shadow, just time moving gently. Jessa Yuri turned from the screen and continued down the hall. Her hair hung loosely down her back, unpinned. There would be time for polish later. For now, she allowed the softness to remain at the end of the corridor. She entered the small room where tea was sometimes prepared before the day truly began. The kettle had already been lit. Steam gathered faintly at its mouth, and the scent of barley and flame lingered in the air. She poured a small cup for herself. No ceremony, no performance, and brought it to her lips. The taste was simple, familiar, not sweet, not bitter, just warm. She sat on the low cushion near the window, legs tucked beneath her, the cup cradled in her palms. The willow house had begun to awaken, but for now. In this room, in this moment, Suori remained untouched by its rituals, not pretending, not performing, just present. The cup of tea grew cooler in her hands, but she did not rush to drink it. Outside, a bird called softly from the willow, and the house, as it always did, listened. A soft knock came at the doorframe, 3 short taps. Light enough not to demand, but enough to announce presence. Suori didn't flinch. She recognized the rhythm. It belonged to Hannah, one of the younger girls tasked with morning errands. Always early, always careful. "Shall I bring the hair kit?" came the voice, barely louder than the wind. Suri answered with only a nod, though she knew Hannah wouldn't see it. She placed her tea down slowly, the warmth now settled in her fingertips, and rose from the cushion with the same careful poise she used in every movement the house had taught her. The corridor was busier now. Footsteps passed like drifting leaves, soft, practiced, unhurried. Two voices whispered near the front parlor. Suri returned to her room. The light had changed. The sun was higher now, spilling through the shoji, in pale gold bands, cutting across her futon and laying soft shadows on the wall. She stood in that light for a moment, letting it find her, warm her collarbone, brushed the side of her face like a hand that didn't dare to stay. Hannah entered silently, carrying the small, lacquered box of combs and pins. She set it down and bowed, her gaze low. "Your braid loosened in the night," she murmured. "Say, you are." I moved to the mirror. She sat without speaking, pulling her sleeves gently over her wrists. The combs were already arranged in their usual order first. The wide tooth bone, then the peachwood, then the smaller one carved from lacquered pine. Hannah stepped behind her and began to comb. The first pull was quiet, the second smoother. She worked slowly, not because she was inexperienced, but because Suri never rushed her. Others gave instructions. Suri gave space. They said little. A few words passed between them about the guests expected tonight, about a shipment of tea leaves gone stale, about a new girl who had arrived 2 days earlier and still cried softly after dark. Suri listened, not to respond, but to receive. Her room in these early hours was where words could land gently. The hair was pulled back, twisted, lifted, pinned. The scent of camellia oil rose faintly into the air, mixed with the hint of morning starch from her robe. The final pin slid into place, the one she had kept from the cloth pouch, the simpler of the two. Not ornamented, not gilded, you're smooth, familiar, shaped by time. When Hannah finished, she bowed again and left. Did not rise immediately. She sat in silence, looking not at her reflection, but at the light beside it, how it moved, slowly, across the floor. The kind of movement that spoke not of urgency, but of inevitability. There would be another evening, another robe, another guest, another set of questions asked in soft voices, answered in half smiles and glances beneath lashes. But for now she had this. The echo of combs, the warmth of tea, the weight of the pin in her hair, and the house quiet again, as if it, too, needed a moment to remember who it had been before the day began. She rose from the mirror and walked to the far side of the room, where the outer screen remained partially open. The light had climbed higher now, casting quiet golden lines along the corridor beyond, thin enough to walk between. She slipped into her slippers, their soles worn soft from seasons of slow walking, and stepped into the hallway without a sound. The willow house moved differently in the morning. It's not like evening, when everything danced in practiced rhythm. Morning was quieter, more honest, like time for folding, rinsing, straightening, a time for glances that didn't have to mean anything. 4 sleeves rolled back, hair still drying. Silence shared between women who had spent the night shaping illusions for men who would forget their names. Suri passed the western room, where the dressing mats were being shaken clean. One of the older women rin, with the bent fingers and sharp eyes, nodded to her without stopping her work. A cloud of dust rose from the mats and caught the light like mist, curling and disappearing before it reached the ceiling. She continued walking, until she reached the small garden courtyard. No guests came here. It was hidden, walled in by low wooden panels, with a single cedar tree growing in the center and a bench tucked into the shadow of its branches. This was where the women came when they didn't want to speak, where they brought letters they didn't send, where they cried if they had to. Though always quietly, the cedar's bark had darkened with the rain, and water still clung to the small, flat stones surrounding its base. Sayuri stepped out onto the stones and sat at the edge of the bench, letting her hands fall loosely in her lap. It was here months ago, She had once spoken aloud to no one. One sentence, question that had no answer. She never repeated it, and no one ever asked what she had said. The house, it seemed, knew when to listen, and when to forget. A light breeze passed through the slats in the wall. It carried with it the scent of earth and crushed blossoms, and Suri breathed it in slowly, allowing the moment to fill her chest, to settle into her shoulders, to soften the muscles behind her neck. Somewhere behind her, a bell chimed once. She didn't move. She had until the second chime. That was the rule. The first was for readiness. The second was for return. She looked down at her hands. The fingers still marked faintly with the scent of tea, of camellia, of powder. There were tiny lines there now, lines that hadn't been there the year before. Time had not forgotten her, even if some men had another breath, another breeze, the soft flutter of the cedar above, and then, as the bell rang once more lower this time, drawn out like a sigh, she stood, adjusted the fold of her robe, and walked back toward the house. The matting cooled. Beneath her feet, the hallway grew brighter, and the willow house opened its eyes fully for the day. By the time Siori reached the inner rooms, the day had fully unfurled. Light spilled confidently. Across the wooden floors, no longer the cautious gold of dawn, but a fuller brightness, softened only by the paper screens that lined each hallway. The house had entered its rhythm. Voices passed like murmurs. Sandals slipped across smooth boards, and the scent of broth drifted in from the kitchen, like a memory that had never quite left. She turned toward the main chamber, where the mid-morning preparations were already underway. The housekeeper stood beside a long table, organizing folded robes by color and texture. Each garment had been chosen for a purpose, some to impress, some to soothe, some to blend. None were chosen for comfort. Siri, the housekeeper said without looking up, her voice clipped but calm. You'll take the third room tonight. Siri nodded, stepping beside her. A new guest? The housekeeper gave the faintest tilt of her head, a returning one. The kind who pays too much and asks too little. He's requested silence. Mostly, Suri understood. Some guests came to be entertained, others came to forget. But there was a third kind, the ones who arrived not wanting anything at all. Only the stillness they could not find outside the house. I'll bring thee. Winter fan, she said softly. The housekeeper paused. Her eyes flicked up, reading Suri's expression the way only someone who had lived in the house as long as she had could. Good, she said. That will suit him. Removed to the storage shelf and retrieved the fan. It was plain. Ivory-colored with a single painted stroke of pine along the edge. She ran her fingers across its surface before slipping it into her sleeve. But those who did often remembered. The room assigned to her was near the back, separated from the busier chambers by a short corridor and a narrow stone basin used to catch rain. She walked slowly toward it, letting her thoughts settle into place. Like tea leaves in still water, inside the room was simple. A single scroll hung on the far wall, its ink faded. The window had been opened slightly to let in air, and the tatami smelled fresh, still holding the scent of pressed straw and pine. Dust. She closed the screen gently behind her and stood in the quiet, allowing her eyes to adjust to the light. There was no mirror here, no dressing stool, no lacquered tray. Just a cushion, a floor. She knelt in the center and placed the fan. Beside her, the room did not ask anything of her yet. That was rare. She allowed her body to soften again, let her shoulders fall from their practiced height. Her breath grew deeper, slower. She did not rehearse her expressions. She did not think of the guest, nor the evening ahead. She thought only of how the air tasted dry, faintly metallic, touched by cedar and ink. A sound approached from the hall. Soft footsteps, not urgent. The screen shifted. He stood there tall, wrapped in charcoal robes, a face she could not quite place. Perhaps she had seen him once in a different season. Or perhaps not at all. They looked at each other for a moment. No greeting, no bow, just recognition of a shared silence. He stepped inside. She did not rise. He did not ask her to. And for a while, they both remained there, two figures in a plain room, separated by air and memory, held together by the quiet only this house ever seemed to know how to offer. Time passed. The fan lay between them, untouched, outside. The wind moved through the basin, lifting a single drop of rain from the stone, spinning it once in the air, then letting it fall. The willow had gone still. The pond reflected the pale pink sky with her. The guest settled across from her, folding his legs with the ease of someone who had done this many times before here, or somewhere like it. He did not adjust his robe. He did not reach for tea. He simply sat, spine straight, eyes lowered, his presence filling the room without overtaking it. Suri remained still, her hands resting in her lap, her breath as slow as the wind outside the screen. Neither of them spoke. It was not silence out of awkwardness, nor habit. It was chosen, maintained, like a thin fabric stretched between them, too delicate to press against. Suri had grown used to this kind of presence, the kind that spoke most clearly through what was left unsaid. She studied him gently. His robe was simple, but finely made. The way he held his hands loosely, not clenched, suggested he had not come with questions. Only weight, the kind that people carried when words had become too heavy to shape aloud. After some time, he drew a small pouch from his sleeve and placed it between them. It was made of dark blue cloth worn at the corners. She didn't reach for it. She didn't even glance at it for long, just enough to acknowledge it was there. "For incense," he said quietly, the words barely above the sound of breath. She nodded once. He did not elaborate. Suri leaned slightly to her side, reaching for the small ceramic dish placed behind the screen. She opened the pouch, revealing a pinch of dried wood shavings, nearly black, soft at the edges. She placed a small amount on the dish and struck the match with a practiced motion quick. Quiet, reverent, the scent rose slowly. Not sharp, not floral. A dark, grounded aroma that reminded her of temples in winter, of lacquered boxes and old stone floors. It filled the room without rushing, curling around them in thin ribbons, clinging to the folds of their clothing. The corners of the screen, the breath between them. He closed his eyes. She didn't. She watched the smoke, watched how it rose, then dipped, then curled in upon itself, how it disappeared before it touched the ceiling, how it resembled thought fragile, beautiful, and gone before it could be fully held. Minutes passed. The incense burned low. She didn't stir, neither did he. Eventually, his gaze returned to hers, not direct, not demanding, just present. "I don't remember your voice," he said. Suri tilted her head gently. "Perhaps you never heard it." He considered that. A faint smile passed across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think I came here once, long ago." She didn't confirm it. He didn't need her to. There was a heaviness in his breath now, as though he had been holding something for hours or years, and was now unsure whether to let it rest here or carry it back with him. She picked up the fan beside her and opened it slowly. The painted pine, simple and curved, caught the light. She held it without movement, then placed it gently on the floor between them. The gesture deliberate, the meaning unspoken. He understood, or at least he accepted. His hands moved toward it, but not to take it tonely to rest near it, close enough to feel what had been offered, far enough not to take more than what was given. The incense had burned nearly to ash. Still, the room was thick with scent, memory, weight. Suri lowered her gaze, not out of submission, out of care. He stayed seated a while longer. She did not mark the time. Eventually, without prompting, he rose. His robe fell neatly back into place. He bowed not deeply, not shallowly, just enough. She returned the gesture. Her hands remained in her lap. The fan stayed where it was. He stepped to the screen, paused once more, then passed through it without looking back. The room settled. The incense cooled, and Sayuri remained where she was, seated in the quiet, watching the thin curl of final smoke disappear into the stillness of the willow house. She didn't move, not even after the smoke vanished. The hush that followed his departure wasn't empty, it was full of what hadn't been spoken, full of breath that had been shared across silence. Full of the invisible weight that guests always left behind, weight that drifted gently into the corners of the room, where it would linger for days before the air remembered how to forget. The fan still rested between her and the space he had. Occupied, she didn't retrieve it. Letting it remain where it was felt right. It had done its part. Words had been spared. That was its gift. Outside the screen, the house continued in its rhythm. The sounds were distant slippers across hallways, bowls being cleared, the occasional murmur of a voice in passing, but they belonged to another layer of the day, not here. Not in this room, which still felt suspended, like breath held just before the exhale. Shiori slowly lifted her hands, one palm resting over the other, and placed them softly against her chest. Her head bowed slightly, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. Something had passed between them. She didn't know his name, might never see him again, but the space they'd shared was now marked, and she would carry that mark, quiet as it was. She rose with the same slowness she had held throughout the meeting. Her limbs remembered not to disturb the floor. Robe fell into place without being arranged. She stepped lightly to the side of the room, took the incense dish, and emptied the ash into a small lacquer box that sat quietly on the shelf, its surface dulled from years of use. Corners worn by the fingertips of many women, ash was never thrown away here. It was stored. A silent archive of every night's forgetting. She paused before closing the box. Let her fingers rest on its lid. It was warm, just barely. With the incense cleared and the room returned to its plain, patient shape, Siri stepped to the screen and opened it gently. The hallway outside had grown brighter. Afternoon light slid in from the high windows, soft and slanted, the kind that made the wooden walls glow as if they were lit from within. She walked through the corridor without haste. One hand brushed her sleeve as she moved, the other trailing lightly along the wall, touching the old knots in the wood that she had memorized years ago, each bump and ridge a tiny landmark in her daily return. The house breathed with her, around her. Through her, she passed the water basin on her way back, its surface flat, undisturbed. A single petal floated there, white with the faintest hint of pink. It spun slowly in place, caught in the rhythm of the fountain's drip. Siri paused to watch it. She didn't know where it had fallen from. Perhaps from the upper terrace. Perhaps from someone's hair. Perhaps it had simply always been there. Waiting for this moment to be noticed, she didn't touch it. She only bowed her head slightly in its direction, then continued on. Her room was quiet when she returned. The screen had not been opened. The robe she had left folded near the basin remained undisturbed. Her teacup, emptied earlier, sat where she had left it. No one had come in. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She stepped inside, pulled the screen gently closed, and sat once more beside the window, legs tucked beneath her, hands resting loosely in her lap. The light had begun to shift again, less gold now, more amber. Outside, the willow moved, and inside, Siri let the stillness find her again. She sat in the warm quiet, unmoving, letting the light stretch across her knees like fabric pulled gently by time. The day had softened. That late hour when the sun prepares to leave but hasn't yet said goodbye hung around her like the last notes of a lullaby. Everything inside the Willow house responded to that hour with memory. The walls creaked just once. The floor cooled underfoot. Even the lanterns, still unlit, seemed to glow faintly, as if anticipating dusk. Siri traced the grain of the wood beside her, fingertips brushing over a shallow groove left by a dropped comb seasons ago. She hadn't sanded it out. Imperfection kept her company. Her gaze drifted beyond the open window where the willow's shadows swayed across the stone. There had been a time, not long ago, when she used to write. Letters never sent. Pages folded and tucked behind scroll boxes, never signed. It wasn't for the words. It was for the sound of the brush, the movement of her hand. The sensation of leaving something behind Evan, if it would be burned. She hadn't written in weeks. She thought of the fan still lying in the quiet room. The blue pouch of incense. The man who came and went like a season not marked on any calendar. Her body felt heavier now, not with tiredness, but fullness. a sense that the silence of the day had built up inside her like steam behind a screen. Not painful, not urgent, just there. She rose, not quickly. The house did not like sudden movements. Her robe whispered against itself as she stood and stepped toward the small writing table in the corner of her room. It hadn't been used since spring. She pulled open the shallow drawer, revealing a half-used roll of paper, an inkstone, and the old brush with the cracked handle. She poured just enough water into the well, ground the ink slowly. The scent of it rose earthy, faintly metallic, something between memory and stone. Kneeling, she placed her hand on the paper, not to write yet, just to feel its weight. The house was quiet behind her, no voices, no footsteps, only the occasional click of wood settling deeper into its frame. When she finally lifted the brush, she didn't write a name, didn't write a greeting. Her strokes were slow, deliberate. She wrote of a breeze passing through the garden, of the sound a robe makes when someone leaves too quietly, of the way incense smoke moves like thought. She didn't say who it was for. She didn't say who she was. When the ink dried, she folded the paper once, then again. She didn't seal it, didn't hide it. She simply placed it beside her teacup and returned to the window. The willow had gone still. The pond reflected the pale pink sky without a ripple. Somewhere in the house a shutter closed, gently, like someone had remembered to protect what was inside. The air had cooled. She closed her eyes, not to rest, but to listen, to the house breathing, to the garden holding its breath, to the soft hush of a name never spoken aloud. And as the evening reached in through the window, soft and slow, Cerie remained, where she was quiet, still, and entirely within the moment that had chosen to stay a little longer with her. The room dimmed without effort. Light did not leave all at once. Here it lingered, softening like a whispered goodbye. The paper screens no longer glowed. They simply faded, like the end of a dream not meant to be remembered. Cerie did not light the candle. Not yet. There was a kind of peace in the in-between, in that hush that held the room like silk. Outside, the garden had fallen into shadow. The pond reflected nothing now, only the idea of light, the memory of sky. The willow stood motionless, its long branches gently resting against the earth, as though sleeping upright. Cerie remained near the window, eyes open but unfocused. Her breath had slowed, her posture had softened, the lines of her body no longer arranged for anyone else. She was not being observed. She did not need to shape herself. She was simply part of the room. In the distance, the low hum of a shamisen began. Not a performance. Just someone practicing in another wing of the house, half-hearted, uneven, but comforting. The notes hung in the air like half-spoken thoughts. Curling through the hallways, brushing across the walls like wind, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, hands folding together. The ink on her fingers had dried. Didn't wipe it away. From behind the far wall, footsteps approached, slow, soft, deliberate. A servant's pace. Cerie didn't turn. A moment later, a folded piece of paper slid gently beneath her door. No knock, no voice. The paper was small, precise. She reached for it without breaking the silence and opened it with care. The ink was still fresh. The characters were neat. It was a message from the housekeeper. A guest had returned, not the one from the incense. The message said nothing more. It didn't need to. Cerie sat quietly for another breath, then stood and crossed the room. She placed the note beside the folded letter she had written earlier. They did not touch. Each belonged to a different hour. She drew her inner robe around her a little tighter and walked to the lacquered box beneath, the shelf. Inside were her evening pins, each chosen for its weight and meaning. She did not hesitate. She reached for the plain wanivry, old, familiar. She held it for a moment in her palm, then set it down again. Tonight she would wear no pin. She stepped toward the door and slid it open. The hallway greeted her with its usual hush. Lanterns had been lit now. They glowed softly against the wooden beams, their light trembling just enough to make shadows sway. She began to walk, not quickly, not slowly, just with purpose. With calm, her steps did not echo. They never did. And as the house breathed in for another night, Tit's walls bracing gently for names, for laughter, for things unspoken, Surrey moved quietly through it, a part of its rhythm, its stillness, its memory. The door ahead would open. The guest would speak or stay silent. The room would receive them both, and the night, as always, would begin again. The guest room had been prepared sparsely, elegantly, with the kind of care that left nothing extra and nothing missing. A single cushion had been placed beside the low table, its edges perfectly aligned with the mat. A small tray of untouched tea rested nearby, the steam having long since faded, but the warmth still held faintly in the ceramic. Siri entered without sound. Her robe trailed like a breath behind her. She paused just beyond the threshold, allowing the quiet of the room to settle around her, to welcome her without fanfare. There was no curtain to draw, no name to speak, only presence. He was all ready. There he sat with his back to the screen, face turned slightly toward the window. His robe was simple and adorned, unassuming. His posture was deliberate, hands folded together in his lap, his breath even. He didn't rise when she entered. He didn't need to. The stillness between them acknowledged everything. So Rhys stepped forward and knelt opposite him, folding into the movement like ink into water. Her sleeves whispered against the floor as she settled. For a long moment, they said nothing. Outside, the breeze shifted. The faint sound of the wind slipping between the narrow gaps in the roof beams sighed across the ceiling. The lantern's glow trembled once, casting his shadow against the wall long, softened. Bowed, he looked at her.
Not with recognition.
Not with curiosity, just presence. You haven't changed, he said, her head tilted slightly. The same way she might respond to a question that hadn't been asked. He glanced at the tea. Didn't reach for it. I wondered if this house would. Still remember me. Sari kept her hands folded. That doesn't remember names, she said softly. Only the way someone enters. He smiled faintly, but his eyes held something distant, something unfinished. I used to come here, when I thought forgetting was easier than remembering, he said. She let his words hang in the air. They didn't require an answer, only patience. I would sit here, he continued, speak to someone like you, drink a little, laugh once, leave a coin and for a few hours. I could pretend I was no one. Suri didn't move. That was enough, then he added. Now he stopped outside. The sound of a single water drop echoed from the basin. I've forgotten what I wanted to forget, he said finally, but I still carry it. Suri let her eyes rest on the space between them. This house doesn't ask you to leave it behind, she said, only to place it down for a while. He looked at the floor. His fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed. Do you ever forget who you are? He asked. Why you are. I was quiet for a long time. When the house is silent, she whispered, I remember too much. When it is full, I remember nothing. I've learned to live in the space between. He breathed deeply, not heavy, just present. I thought I came for silence, he said, but maybe I came to hear something I forgot how to say. Suri reached for the teapot and poured without speaking. The liquid fell in a soft stream, a ribbon of heat that rose briefly in the air before vanishing. She pushed the cup toward him with both hands, her sleeves brushing the mat. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. The room had accepted both. Of them, he lifted the cup, held it near his chest, but didn't drink. They sat like that two shapes in a quiet room. The tea growing cooler between breaths, the house listening without judgment, and outside, beneath the willow's waiting branches. The night pressed gently against the windows, asking nothing, demanding nothing, only staying. Time no longer moved in lines. It breathed in circles around them, soft and weightless, folding into the corners of the room like mist. Ori sat with her hands resting lightly in her lap, eyes lowered, not in submission, but in rhythm. The room did not ask her to perform. This wasn't that kind of silence. He held the teacup without drinking. It warmed his palms, not enough to comfort, just enough to remind him he was here, still part of the room. Still someone. He opened his mouth once as if to speak, but no words came. Suri didn't wait. She knew this moment. She had shared it before with others who carried more silence than speech. The space between them remained gentle, balanced, like a page half-turned. The man finally set the cup down. His fingers hovered at the rim a moment longer, before retreating. "I didn't think I'd return," he said, voice low. "Few do," Sayori answered, the edges of her voice barely lifting. He looked at her. Not sharply, not searching, just long enough to register that she had meant it without judgment. "When I first came here," continued, "I thought it was a place to disappear." She said nothing, but it wasn't, he went on, more to the room than to her. "It was a place where the parts I buried sat beside me and waited, quiet, patient. It scared me." Suri's eyes lifted slightly, the way a flame might flicker. When stirred by breath, even silence must be met. She murmured. He nodded slowly. "I wonder," he said, "if the house ever forgets." "No," Suri said. "It softens." He leaned back, resting one hand against the mat behind him. His robe shifted slightly. The candlelight traced the folds like slow-moving water. "There was someone I used to write to," he said after a long pause. "I never sent the letters. I thought the act of writing would make me forget." Suri listened. "I stopped writing," he said, when the words began to feel like hers. Outside, the wind moved again through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant ash. Somewhere beyond the walls, a door closed gently. A slipper shifted. A breath caught in another room, but here, none of it intruded. She looked toward the candle on the table. Its flame danced once, bending slightly toward him as if reaching. "I wrote a letter today," Siri said, quiet enough for the words to almost vanish. "I didn't sign it." He looked at her, waiting. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. And in that, shared withholding. Something softened between them. Not a bond, not a promise, but a recognition, mutual knowing that nothing more was needed. He placed both hands flat on the mat, a gesture of grounding. "It's not farewell. I will carry this with me," he said. "Said so I." "You are," I nodded once. "You don't have to hold it tightly." He breathed, deep and slow. Then he rose. She did not move. He walked to the screen, paused, and placed one hand briefly on the wood. His head bowed, not a gesture of respect, but gratitude disguised in simplicity, and then he left. The candle flame straightened the door, whispered closed. Suri sat in the stillness. She did not exhale. The room did it for her. Outside, the night thickened gently around the house, settling like a second roof, a blanket across the sky, and within the quiet walls of the willow house, the silence began to gather once more, patient, steady, and whole. She remained seated, even after the last of his steps faded into the floorboards. Not because she was waiting, because there was nowhere else to go. The room was still holding him, the shape of his voice still floating between the walls. The scent of tea, now cooled, lingered just enough to remind her that something had happened. Not an event, not a moment with a name, just something. Suri turned her gaze toward the candle again. It was burning lower now. The wax had begun to pool at its base, catching the soft gold light and folding it back into itself. Shadows played gently across the mat, quiet and long. Like someone laying down beside her and whispering without sound, she stood, slowly letting her robe fall into place with its usual grace. Her hands moved without urgency, gathering the teacups, the tray, the fan left untouched on the table's edge. Each motion belonged to a ritual, not written down, only learned. Repeated, passed silently from one woman to another as she stepped. Out into the hallway, the house greeted her with hush and glow. Lanterns flickered at regular intervals, their light catching in the corners like warm dust. A few doors remained cracked, voices low, laughter muted, but mostly the house had entered. Its softest hour, the breath between its thoughts. She returned the tray to the kitchen herself. It was not her duty, not at this hour, but no one stopped her. The other women glanced her way, nodding gently before returning to their own quiet tasks. Folding napkins, heating water, polishing the brass mouth of a teapot that hadn't been used in weeks. Sayori placed the tray beside the sink and rinsed the cups in silence. The water warm but not hot, the steam faint and slow to rise. She dried them with careful fingers, placing each one back into the tray with the same care she might offer to a guest who had spoken kindly and asked nothing more. She returned to her room after that. The walk felt longer than before, and not because of distance, but because she carried something now, not heavy, not visible, but real. When she entered, the air inside greeted her gently. Her robe from earlier still rested, folded beside the window. The letter she'd written was where she left it, untouched. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the basin and poured water into the shallow bowl. She dipped the cloth gently and pressed it to her neck, then her wrists, then across her closed eyes. The coolness grounded her, drew her fully back into the room, into herself. She lit a single stick of incense, this one pale gray, unscented, clean. It gave off no fragrance, only a wisp of smoke that rose like thought, unformed and drifting. She placed it by the window. She undid her sash, folded her robe, and lay down, not curled, not held tight, just stretched softly on her side, one arm beneath her pillow, the other resting beside her open. The house creaked once above her, the sound long and low, like a yawn from a place older than anyone inside it. The incense continued, to burn unnoticed by anything but time, and Suri let her eyes close, not with the intention of sleep only to join the stillness. The letter remained beside the candle, no name on the paper, no destination in mind, only a few lines written slowly. During the moment when day gave itself to night, and outside the willow house, the wind passed without knocking, carrying no stories, asking no questions, just moving on. The night grew deeper, not darker. Darkness in the willow house was never harsh. It unfolded like a second skin, wrapping the rooms, softening their edges, making the world inside feel smaller and slower. The shadows didn't hide things, they cradled them. Sayori didn't move. She lay as she had settled, her breath slow. Not yet drawn into the pull of sleep, but resting near its threshold. Her body was still, but her awareness floated gently like a paper boat set loose on still water. She wasn't remembering. She wasn't dreaming. She was simply present, held within the silence like a word too sacred to speak. The incense burned. In its dish, the final curl of smoke rising upward, then disappearing. It had no scent, and yet the room carried its weight, quiet reminder that something had been honored here, even if no one would name it. Outside, a shutter clicked softly in the wind. One of the kitchen doors, perhaps. Or the gate beyond the pond, the one that always shifted slightly when the moon was high. Siri didn't open her eyes. She knew the sound. The house had many kinds of breath, and this one was familiar. Exhale, pause, settle. A voice murmured somewhere in the west wing. Not loud enough to catch, not urgent. It's just two people passing between thoughts. The mat beneath her creaked as her body adjusted, only slightly. Her fingers curled loosely near her waist, and she sighed, quiet and even. As if giving permission for the room to finally rest, she thought of the guest, not his name, not his words, but the silence between them. The stillness they had shared. Some presences didn't leave you. They didn't ask for memory. They simply folded themselves into the way you moved the next day, into the way you held a cup, into the way your hands settled when you thought no one was watching. The letter remained on the table, still folded, its paper soft at the edges from how many times she had picked it up and set it back down. She had not burned it. She would not. But it did not need to be sent. It had already done its work. She didn't know if she would. Write again tomorrow. She didn't know if he would return. She didn't need to. The house, after all, did not live in plans. It lived in moments and stillness, in breaths drawn slowly through the ribs of wooden walls and old cloth robes. The candle flickered once, then dipped low. Its light reached only as far as her elbow. It didn't need to do more. and Suri. At last, allowed her breath to slow into. Sleep not sudden, not deep, just enough to drift. The house did not exhale. It simply waited, as it always had, as it always would. The candle extinguished itself before dawn. There was no final flicker, no hiss, just a quiet disappearance, the last thread of light vanishing into the folds of the room like it had never been lit at all.
Oh.
The darkness left behind was soft, complete. It held no fear, only rest. Suri's sleep was shallow but whole, not heavy, not restless only even. She didn't shift. She didn't speak. Her body remained still in that perfect shape the house had memorized, as though the room had placed her there like a figure in a painting. It's meant to be kept exactly as she was. Outside, the willow was motionless. Even the wind knew not to stir. This hour, the pond did not ripple. The koi slept deep beneath the surface, invisible, still. The rest of the house lay quiet. No footsteps, no trays. The corridors had not yet opened their eyes. The women remained in their rooms. The screens had not moved. No one had spoken. It was the hour between the hours where memory thins and time forgets itself. Inside Suri's room, the air cooled just slightly. The scent of unscented ash lingered in the corners. Her robe had slipped from her shoulder, but her body had not moved. Her fingers, still curled softly, rested near her pillow, a kind of stillness that only came when nothing was expected. When no name needed to be worn in this hour, the willow house watched her, not with eyes, with presence, with walls that remembered the curve of her breath, with floorboards that had carried her weight again and again without ever asking her to be lighter, with beams above that had grown used to holding her silence. Somewhere in the northern wing, a door creaked, slowly, respectfully, a servant preparing the water for morning tea. A sound so familiar it did not disturb the silence, it only completed it. Siori's breath deepened, not to wake, just to change shape. The house felt it. It marked the shift. Light had not yet come, but the sky outside was beginning to pale, not with color, but with permission. The air thinned near the roof. The garden yawned, leaf by leaf. Somewhere behind a closed screen, someone turned over in their sleep, a name half formed in a dream, then forgotten again. Siri stirred, not fully her. Breath caught for a moment, just enough to know she was still inside her body. The robe slipped a little more. Her fingers curled inward, but she did not rise. She had nowhere to be yet, nowhere to perform. Only this breath, this moment, this hush. The letter still rested on the table, untouched, unread, folded in quiet confidence. She didn't need to see. She knew what it said. Outside the house, the willow waited for light. Inside, the woman and the house held each other in stillness, in time, for just a little longer, agreed not to move. The sky began to lighten behind the screen, not yet blue. Not yet warm, just pale, like memory diluted through fog, kind of light that doesn't land, only brushes. It touched the edge of the window and crept inward, folding across the floor like an old silk robe forgotten over a chair. Suri's body began to shift in answer, not in urgency, only in rhythm. Her legs stretched beneath the fabric, toes flexing. Gently, as if waking without needing to rise, her head tilted slightly on the pillow. The house had taught her not to wake all at once, not to disturb the hour before dawn. This was a sacred time, space not meant for conversation or purpose only, for presence. She opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above was still dark, the beams tracing their familiar paths across her gaze. She didn't look toward the letter. She didn't need to. It was still there, was she? For a while she didn't sit up, listen to the way the wind had returned, barely. Rustling a loose corner of the screen with a sound like paper being turned, to the way a bowl clinked lightly in the next room. Someone preparing rice too early for the rest to notice, to the faintest sound of footsteps padding down the hall. Careful not to wake the day too loudly, Sayuri finally rose, folding her legs beneath her before pushing herself upright. The robe fell from her shoulder completely now, and she gently adjusted it not out of modesty, but habit. Her skin was cool, but not cold. The air inside the willow house never bit. It simply reminded. She moved to the basin again, pouring water from the small ceramic pitcher into the bowl. It splashed gently, the only bold sound in the room. She cupped her hands beneath it, let it pool there, then pressed it to her face. Over her closed eyes, her cheeks, the hollow below her lips, not to wake, to remember where she was. Each gesture grounded her back into the world. The tea from the night before had dried in the cup, leaving a pale ring of memory she did not clear. Not yet. The letter remained folded on the table. She passed her fingers across the top of it once. Not enough to open, just to greet it. Then, rising fully, she stepped to the screen. The garden was still wrapped in shadow, though the first hints of gold clung to the far stones near the pond. The willow had begun to move again, its branches swaying slowly like a sleeper stretching after a long dream. The pond, still quiet, caught a single reflection, her own dim, wavering, but whole. She slid open the screen and stepped barefoot onto the wooden walkway. The wood was cool beneath her soles, smooth with age. The scent of morning was faint but clean charcoal, dew, and the distant sweetness of plum bark soaked overnight for ink. She stood there for a moment, letting the breeze thread through the ends of her hair. Lifting it just slightly, a sparrow darted once through the courtyard and vanished beyond the roof. She closed her eyes again. The letter still waited. The house did too. But in this moment, its light finally began to cross the garden wall. Siri let herself belong to nothing. Not to the night before, not to the day ahead. Just this breath and the way the house, without asking, held her in its silence. The first call of the bell came softly one long, low note that drifted across the rafters like a ribbon loosened by wind. It did not command. It reminded. The house was stirring now, though gently, like someone waking with their eyes still closed. That single chime was not for the guests. It was for the women. For those who moved unseen. Sauri. Stepped back inside. The wooden floor had warmed slightly in the few minutes she had stood outside. Kissed by the earliest thread of sun filtering over the roof tiles, she left the screen open just a little, letting the breeze follow her in. It didn't disturb the room, moved around, introspectful, familiar. She folded her sleeping robe and placed it beside the basin. A second robe, lighter in color, hung waiting, pale gray, worn at the cuffs. She pulled it over her shoulders, tying it without ceremony. The fabric held the faintest scent of sandalwood from days past. Her fingers smoothed the knot once, then let it be. A low knock touched the edge of her door, 2 short taps followed. By a pause, Siri did not answer. She walked to the door and slid it open halfway. A young girl stood outside, head lowered, tray in her hands. On it, a fresh cloth, a second cup, a small dish of pickled radish. 2 plums split and fanned like open hands. Simple, kind, a gesture from the house. It's not a request. Siri bowed slightly in thanks, took the tray and slid the door shut again. She set it on the edge of the mat without sitting to eat. The food was not for hunger, it was for anchoring. She took 1 plum between her fingers, skin cool and taut. She held it there a moment before placing it back in the dish untouched. Her gaze moved once more toward the letter. Still folded, still silent, she sat beside it, not to open it, not to add anything, only to be near it. The day had arrived, but it had not yet made demands. This was still the hour of possibility where nothing had yet been chosen. The walls glowed softly now. The grain of the wood had taken on a golden warmth. Dust floated gently in the air near the window, each fleck moving on its own slow path, each one a memory too light to fall. She heard someone laugh in the courtyard briefly, then footsteps, then silence again. Siri placed both palms on the floor, leaned forward slightly, and breathed in deeply through the nose, through the ribs, through every place in her that remembered how to receive. The scent of the mat, the ink still drying. Somewhere else in the house, the faint iron in the water basin. All of it spoke to her without speaking. She didn't know if today would bring another guest. She didn't know if he would return. She didn't wonder in the willow house. The question was never who or when. It was only how still could one become, how softly could one listen, how fully. Could one remain? And in this hour, with no footsteps at her door, and no curtain drawn, Suri sat beside the letter she would not send, beneath a roof that remembered every name she had never spoken, and waited not for anyone, only for the day to pass through her. The light deepened slowly, not brighter, just fuller gold, melting into the beams above her, warming the edges of the floor. The willow house never rushed toward morning. It allowed the day to unfold like fabric being gently unrolled. The folds quiet and deliberate, the corners never sharp. Sayuri still had not touched the food. The second cup remained unused. She sat with her hands resting loosely on her knees, her posture soft but balanced, as if her body knew how to carry the silence without being taught. Outside, the garden stirred more now. Sparrow darted across the pond, skimming its glassy surface. A leaf fell. Another breeze moved, whispering across the walkway like silk sliding off polished wood in the hallway. A screen opened slowly, not near, a distant part of the house. The morning rhythm had begun. Guests would begin to rise. Some would speak, some would not. The women would move between rooms like water, smooth and unspoken, faces composed, steps precise. Each one part of the quiet machinery that held the house in its delicate shape. Sayuri did not rise. She reached again for the letter, fingers grazing its folded edge. She lifted it, turned it, pressed the crease gently with her thumb. Held. No seal. It had no address. It's only a few strokes of ink inside, written with hands that did not shake, but had carried too much. She simply placed it in the sleeve of her robe and stood. The tray she left. It's untouched. She slid open the door and stepped out. The hallway had taken on its morning rhythm. The lanterns had been extinguished. The soft glow replaced by shafts of light, filtering through the narrow windows, each one drawing faint patterns along the corridor floor lines that moved as the sun climbed. She walked with calm precision, her footfall silent, her body part of the space rather than moving through it. She passed no one. The other women were elsewhere. She did not need company. The west corridor opened into the inner garden, where stones had been arranged in careful patterns decades ago. Moss had grown between them like threads in an old cloth. Suri stepped onto the flat stones barefoot, the earth beneath them slightly cool. At the edge of the path stood the small fire basin, old, low-brimmed bowl of bronze, worn smooth by the hands that had carried it through generations. A few curls of yesterday's ash still lay at its bottom. The scent of past smoke lingered faintly, like the memory of a name said only once. Suri knelt beside it, one hand resting on the rim. She removed the letter from her sleeve, still folded, still weightless. She held it above the basin, but did not. Let go. The air moved. The willow shadow reached toward her across the garden floor. She remained still. Then, slowly, she set the letter down beside the basin, not in it. It did not belong to fire this morning. It belonged to air. She stood again, the sleeve of her robe now empty. The hem brushing the stone with each step, she turned from the basin and returned to the corridor. The house took her in again without a word, and as she passed beneath the arch of the hallway, where light fell through a narrow opening in the roof, the breeze followed once more, soft, absent of urgency. Moving through her like a thought not yet fully formed, the willow house did not need to ask. It knew she would return. When she was ready, she walked the length of the corridor with her gaze low, not from weariness, but from the quiet dignity that the house itself had taught her. Eyes lifted only when the space asked for it, when a gesture was required, or when memory pulled upward from some deep, slow place. The beams above still held last night's warmth. Her shadow followed without sound. As she passed the painted screen near the eastern wing, she paused, not because of what was behind it, but because of what it reminded her of. The inked mountains, softened by time, were almost faded to dust. Long ago, someone had brushed them into being with such care that even now, the strokes carried breath, were not scenes. They were stillness made visible. She touched the edge of the screen. A moment, no more. In the small gallery beyond, a pair of slippers rested neatly outside a guest chamber. She recognized their shape, the same man who had arrived and left without ceremony. He had stayed. Sayori did not stop. She continued past. The door, steps unwavering, robe swaying like a soft answer. She didn't need to speak with him. His presence was not a question. Hers was not an answer. They had already exchanged everything the night before, through silence, through the careful arrangement of tea and time, through words that did not seek conclusion. By the time she returned to her own room, the day had tilted fully into gold. The candle was gone, the tea was cool, the plums remained untouched, and the letter's absence was not a gap, it was a quiet breath the room had already exhaled. She placed her hands on her knees again and sat with her spine straight, eyes soft. Outside, the garden began to hum with faint light broom strokes. The creak of a water bucket. Fabric being shaken out in the wind, say, you or I closed. Her eyes, she did not sleep. She did not think. She listened to the breath of the house. As it filled the silence with warmth, to the garden, leaning into the light, to the weight of a morning that did not demand to be remembered. The breeze moved through the open screen, lifting a corner of the mat before settling again. She let it pass through her hair, across her skin, and out the other side. No guest knocked. No voice called her name. She belonged to the hour, and the hour belonged to no one. In the heart of the willow house, with nothing written and nothing burned, Sayori remained, not waiting, not ending, just present. As the day continued to unfold, she let it happen without reaching. Let the light deepen. Let the walls speak softly to each other. Let the silence stretch until it became something solid she could lean against. And in that stillness, with all things held gently in their place, the house breathed on by midday. The light had spread like warm tea across the floorboards, gathering in quiet pools at the base of each pillar, softening the corners of the room into gentler shapes. Shadows no longer moved, they rested. Even the dust in the air had settled, no longer dancing, only drifting in slow, deliberate spirals before disappearing into silence. Suri rose without hurry. Her knees barely creaked, her robe unfolding like mist around her legs. The room offered no protest to her movement. It had grown used to her pace, how she shifted between presence and stillness, like breath moving through fabric. She stepped toward the far wall, where the incense dish sat, empty now. Lined with the memory of a single stick burned hours ago, she knelt and cleaned it without effort. Not as a chore, not as a gesture, but as continuation. The soft bristles of the brush moved in patient circles, gathering the ash without scattering it. She carried it to the edge of the veranda, where the wind could take it. No offering, no farewell, just release. Beyond the veranda, the garden had thickened into light. The koi beneath the surface of the pond swam slowly now, their shapes flickering. Beneath the water, like old dreams slipping just out of reach, a single dragonfly hung in the air near the reeds, its wings still, as if balancing between moments. Suri watched without needing to understand. Behind her, the hall remained still. The guests would now be eating, or resting, or composing letters they would never send. The women would be moving through the house like breath in a body that knew its rhythm. There would be the clink of porcelain, the distant slide of doors. But not here. Not in her room. She returned to the letter. Still gone, her sleeve felt lighter, where it used to rest. She did not reach for another. Instead, she sat again by the small writing desk. Its surface was bare now, the inkstone dry, the paper pressed. Flat beneath its weight. The brush lay across the tray, silent and waiting. She dipped it into the water, letting the bristles soften in the shallow bowl before touching the stones low. Practiced, unthinking. She didn't know what she would write. She didn't need to. The brush moved with the weight of her breath, not. Her thoughts, a single line. Then another. No name. No Salutation, only memory, shaped gently into character. Outside, the willow's branches danced, catching the afternoon breeze like silk sleeves moving through a room. The sun pressed against the far wall, warming it until the wood glowed faintly amber. The birds had quieted again. When she finished, the final stroke. Cerie placed the brush down. She didn't reread what she had written. She didn't fold the paper. It could stay open. It could remain. Here, just as it was, she rose and crossed the room to the open screen. The world beyond remained unchanged, still soft, still slow. She stepped out once more, the light pressing around her robe like a second fabric. The floor warm beneath her soles. This time, she did not bring the letter. This time, she brought nothing. She simply stood and let the air hold her in return. The warmth beneath her feet was gentle now, no longer sharp with the crispness of morning. The sun had reached its quiet peak, casting long beams across the inner stones of the garden. The stillness wasn't empty. It was layered, deep, like a bowl slowly filled. Not with sound, but with waiting. Sayori stood at the edge of the veranda, eyes open but unfocused. She wasn't looking for anything. She was simply witnessing. The way the light moved. The way the willow leaned into its own shadow. The way the koi drifted beneath the pond's surface, visible only when they wanted to be. No one else walked the garden paths. This hour, this hush, belonged to those who understood it, those who had learned not to fill it with footsteps or words. Cerie remained motionless, her sleeves shifting only when the breeze slipped between them. She breathed through her nose deeply, but without effort. A breath that touched the ribs, but didn't disturb them. The memory of the letter, the first one. The one folded and placed beside the fire basin drifted briefly through her mind. Not with regret, only with recognition. She had not burned. She had not needed to. Letting it exist in the air had been enough. Some things needed only to be released, not destroyed. Behind her, the house let out a low groan in its joints. Walls flexing, a sound like a body stretching. After long stillness, it made no apology for the noise. It simply reminded her that it was alive, always listening, always holding. Cerie sat on the edge of the veranda, letting her legs hang over the side. Her toes hovered just above the gravel path. The light touched her ankles. Her hands rested. Loosely in her lap, a single bee drifted by, slow and confused, circling the edge of a blossom before disappearing into the shaded crook of the gate. Its presence was brief, but the sound of its wings lingered a hum against silence, like the whisper of something old being remembered. Cerie tilted her head toward the sun, eyes closed, lashes catching the light. She sat like that for a long while, not meditating, not thinking, simply being with what was. Eventually her hands moved again, folded one over the other, fingers pressing gently into her wrist, as if holding a pulse that had gone quiet. Her breath stayed steady, shallow. Now softened by stillness, she knew the day would begin to fade soon, that the light would turn again, shifting from gold to amber and then to gray, that the halls would fill with the gentle music of evening, the creak of trays, the flutter of curtains being drawn, the hush of voices speaking carefully with words chosen not for meaning, but for mood, but for now. She belonged to this middle hour, this exact quiet, this place between. The garden held her in its gaze. The willow swaying as if nodding in time with her breath, and the willow house, wrapped in its own knowing silence, did not ask for more. It only received her. As always, without question, without end. The garden's light began to bend, not sharply, but with the slow grace of something exhaling. Shadows lengthened across the stepping stones, and the edges of the veranda darkened just slightly, like fabric soaked with dusk. Sayori remained seated, her feet still hovering just above the gravel, her hands unmoved. Her presence as quiet as the fading day around her. She watched the shadow of the willow as it stretched toward her, the branches drawing thin fingers along. The garden wall. A koi once active, now circled lazily beneath the surface, their movements broader, less curious. The pond caught the reflection of the eaves above, distorting it with the gentlest Ripple-An image remembered, not exact. Behind her, the house had begun to stir again in small, deliberate gestures. Paper screens shifted. A floorboard sighed. Somewhere a tray was lifted, its contents barely audible porcelain over wood, a whisper rather than a clink. These were the preludes to evening. Nothing loud, nothing formal.
Oh.
Just the house remembering that it must begin again. Suri leaned back, letting her palms rest against the smooth, sun-warmed planks. Her robe pulled slightly at the shoulders, loosening without falling. She tilted her head to the side, not to rest, just to listen differently. The house's breath had changed. It wasn't louder, only more aware, as if preparing to welcome. The night without letting go of the day. She did not rise. She did not speak. She allowed the moment to hold her. There had been times long ago when she would have used this hour to prepare, to draw the screen, to arrange the bowls, to tighten the sash and check the light. But that was before she learned how to let the house do those things for her. Not by magic, not by hand, but by memory. The Willow House remembered how the evening should begin. It did not need to be told. A breeze touched her cheek. She turned her face into it. It carried the scent of cooling stones and the faintest hint of burnt sandalwood, perhaps from another room, perhaps from another day. Her body felt heavier now, not from fatigue, but from gravity remembered, as if the day were finally settling into her bones, asking nothing, giving only quiet weight. She looked once more toward the garden. A petal had fallen into the pond. Pale pink, it floated there, barely moving, the surface too still to disturb it. The reflection of the willow drifted around it like a dream slowly receding. Suri stood. The motion was slow, unforced, like waking from a sleep you hadn't meant to fall into. Her robe settled around her ankles, the hem brushing the boards. With a sound softer than breath, she walked back into her room. The screen closed behind her with a whisper. Not the sound of closing something, but the sound of completing it. Inside, the light had changed. The warmth was leaving. The day was stepping back. She lit no candle. She moved through the dimness. Without needing to see, the tea had cooled beyond. Comfort. The paper on the desk remained open. She did not touch it. She sat again, facing the door, not to wait, only to be still. Outside, the house began to lower its voice, and night, as it always did, waited patiently at the gate. The last of the sun withdrew quietly, as if not to wake anything. No farewell, no burst of color, just a soft turning inward, like someone closing their eyes. The Willow House embraced the change without resistance. Its walls accepted the dark the same way they held the light, without preference, without pause. Siri remained seated, the room dimming around her. She did not reach for the lantern. She did not call for warmth. The shadows came gently, drawing long lines across the floor, folding themselves around the corners. Even the air felt quieter, thicker, as if the silence itself had deepened, wrapping its arms around her shoulders. She drew her knees up slightly and rested her chin atop them, a posture from childhood, not something she did often. But tonight, the shape felt right, contained, small. At peace, the sounds from the rest of the house came like echoes through soft cloth-muffled laughter down the corridor. The faint creak of a tray being carried, the dull clink of a cup set, gently on a wooden sill, no sharpness, nothing hurried. Just the rhythm of women moving through the fabric of evening, somewhere nearby. A shutter clicked closed. A wind moved through the courtyard, lifting a hanging chime into a slow, hesitant song. One note, then another, lighter, then stillness again. Siori closed her eyes, not to sleep, only to listen to everything the house said when no one asked anything of it. The breath of the mat, beneath her, the faint creases in her robe against her. Skin, the way the air touched her bare ankles, cooler now, but not cold. She remained there as the light faded fully, the room now held only in shadows. No candles, no lamps, no fire. Her eyes adjusted gradually, seeing shapes rather than objects, outlines rather than edges. The room no longer looked arranged, it looked remembered. She leaned her head sideways, cheek resting against her knees, arms folded gently across her shins. She let herself drift, not forward, not back, just inside. The house, in return, did not disturb her. It closed around her like a hand around water, not holding, just shaping. And as the stars outside began to press faintly through the dark never, seen only felt Surrey remained unmoving, a part of the silence, a part of the room, a part of the willow house itself.